Okay, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful for the time that we have to study. We're thankful for the time that you've given us on this earth, especially in this time in Earth's history. And Lord, we need your presence through the Holy Spirit to teach us. We know that you've given us this period of time prior to midnight and the midnight cry to understand your truths, to prepare our hearts and our minds so that we can give a message to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, whether they hear or whether they forbear. So we ask for your wisdom and understanding now as we study, as we contemplate on how to share these truths with others, as we try to understand them ourselves. Thank you for hearing our prayer, and we pray and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, in the case of Stephen there. So obviously we're going to continue studying Ezekiel chapter 4, and I don't know how far we will get. We will see, because I want to continue really trying to understand this period of 390 years and 40 years, and then we're also going to address the literal days as well. So I think we should be able to get that done today. Now, I did send out an email with a paper by Frank Hardy. He's an Adventist chronologist. I've read a lot of his papers when I was studying biblical chronology. He rarely comes to the right conclusion, but he gives lots of background information. So he's helpful in that way. Now, what he does in the paper, so I'll just bring it up here. So the paper here is addressing the year-day principle within Adventism, and specifically focusing upon Ezekiel 4, 5, 6, and 9. So chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 and verse 9, trying to understand the issue of how to use Ezekiel and how Adventists use it. And he's going to present solutions. You know, I use those quotation marks there. I wouldn't really call them solutions at all. He creates more confusion probably than anything else as far as Adventists getting a handle upon this. Now, one of the things you will see, there's a quote there that I wanted to read. Yeah, so he's going to quote here from Keel, who's a commentator. And he says, these numbers, however, cannot be satisfactorily explained from a chronological point of view, whether they be reviewed or referred to the time during which Israel and Judah sinned and heaped upon themselves guilt, which was to be punished, or to the time during which they were to atone or suffer punishment for their sins. And he says, it is correct, as Keel says, that so long as we insist on applying the periods in question either to Israel's sin alone or to its punishment alone, no chronological solution is forthcoming. When these two are combined, there's a chronological solution, but we are left asking why Ezekiel should deal with the history of the northern kingdom so long after the fall of Samaria. In all this, there is a missing dimension. Both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah had in common a covenant relationship with one God. The prophecy is not given exclusively from Israel's point of view or from Judah's point of view or Ezekiel's point of view. That is not its orientation. It is given in part from the above, but in part from God's own point of view. God's role in what happens must be taken into account. When the implications of this fact are acknowledged, a cohesive set of historical reminiscences does indeed emerge from the prophet's wild enactment. So, which he's really overstating this when you deal with what?
A vivid enactment.
What's that?
Vivid enactment. You said wild.
Oh, vivid enactment, pardon me. Yes, I said wild. Yeah, I probably need to clean my glasses. So vivid enactment. It wasn't wild, it was vivid. Uh, but usually people often think of it as wild. So as Ezekiel is a bit bizarre. Now he's going to deal a lot here with the year-day principle, and the thing that that he brings out is if he had the correct chronology, he probably would have come to the correct solution to this problem. And the reason why that is he sets down a lot of correct ideas. That is, he recognizes this connection with the dividing of the kingdom. He recognizes the significance of the two periods, 390 and 40, becoming 430 years. So he can see that there are these allusions to things. He doesn't have enough pieces of the puzzle because he doesn't connect it to Millerite history. And so what I'm going to look at is a few other solutions that people have had in regard to understanding this. And I did address it last time a little bit. So we know we have this period of 390 years. So wherever one is going to start it or end it, we know that this is a day for a year. He lies on his left side. This is 390 years where he's going to bear the iniquity when he lies on his side for 390 days. He's going to bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. Now, we know that Israel often refers to northern Israel. But in this case, it's actually relating to both in some ways, because we know that northern Israel doesn't exist for 390 years. And where we are putting this is we're going to put this starting with Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Now, we obviously know that Jeroboam took over the northern kingdom because of Rehoboam's actions. And this is the iniquity that's being addressed to some degree, is this division of the kingdom. But when we look at this iniquity, we see that it actually addresses a bunch of other issues. And those issues have to deal with their false worship. So you can't just look at the division of the kingdom as the iniquity itself. There's obviously more attached to it. Now, we did address the idea that the land is involved. And this is a division of the land of Israel. And we also know that Jeroboam set up the two golden calves, one at Dan and one in Bethel. And so that becomes an interesting point of view as well. So there's lots of things that are happening here when the kingdom divides. Now, based on a person's chronology, this 390 years is going to end at different periods of time. So if you're going to start it here, it's not going to end necessarily at the beginning of the siege. You have to have the right date for that to happen. And as I showed yesterday, that date came from an understanding of the 2520. So there was the 490 years that ends in 607 with the captivity of Daniel. And that's preceded by 70 years, that captivity of Daniel, by Manasseh's captivity. So those two periods of 70 years here, 607, 677, and 537 here, brought us back to 1097, and then this 120 years gave us 977. So now we know that we have 977. But if you had something like 975, which Usher would give, then you're going to get the 390 years ending after the siege of Jerusalem. And a person could make an argument for that. They could say when Ezekiel has the person come who saw the destruction of Jerusalem, that would mark the 390 years. But to be consistent, everything that he's doing is pointing towards the siege, as we will see. So this 977 brings us to 587, and that's the year in which the siege begins. So in having this date, we have a solution for the 390 years. Now, what some people do is they recognize something like this. So there are some people who recognize something about this division of the kingdom, and they connect it here, even if they have a different chronology. Maybe they use ushers. But for the 40 years, and that's what we're going to kind of address here, is for the 40 years, we see some people put it from 31 AD to 70 AD. And this is the 40 years for Judah. So some people do this. Now, of course, that's counting 31 AD as 1, not as 0, so that would be an ordinal count. But that would be allowed. And I don't think that that's wrong. I think that there's actually an application in which you can look at that. But one of the things that we have about Ezekiel's prophecy is that he's predicting this siege. Now, we know that he's going to be predicting this event as well. And we've showed that other places, and we're going to look at that again. So this is somewhat satisfactory. We could take this as being the destruction of Jerusalem. So if somebody wanted to, put this as 975 and go to 586 with the destruction of Jerusalem, you would have a 390 years, including this year as year 1, just like you would with the 40 years here. So I've seen people do that. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad application, except that we have some details that end up being missed out. So in a general sense, you could make this application. You could say Israel has this, and this is going to be finally the destruction of Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, and then just with the tribe of Judah only existing, even though it only exists here, but this is connected to that, then you would have this 40 years. And if I didn't have the understanding that I have, I would probably accept this idea as sufficient. So, we're not doing that. We're going to be doing this, and I'm still going to say that this is somewhat valid. So I'm not going to say that that's not correct. But there's something else happening here, and that is, and we're going to see this in a bit more detail when we look at Ezekiel's literal time. But I want to point out how I do it, even though many of you know, is I put the 40 years here, and I'm going to mark this. So this is 587, and this is going to be 627. So that's 40 years, 627 BC. Now, this event puts us in the 13th year of Josiah.
You still have
What's
970. You rubbed out 975 and then put 975 back again.
Well, that's pretty bad. Okay, 977. Sorry about that. So that means this is a period of 350 years. And where the key came for me was in studying this chronology. This 13th year of Josiah has two significations. So one is it's the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry. And I believe I've seen other people bring this out. I don't think Hardy does, but I think I've seen other people do this. So they'll say that Jeremiah begins his ministry in the 13th year of Josiah. And initially, that was where I had stopped. I'd looked at Jeremiah's ministry and I said, well, here's a period of time. Jeremiah begins prophesying, and Josiah is going to begin these reforms, but these reforms fail. And so this was a period, now we say it's the iniquity of Israel that he has to bear it, but the iniquity is the failure of this reform. That's the way that I address that. Now, as time went on, as I was studying this more closely, I looked at the history here, and this history is specifically, I looked at 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. So 1 Kings chapter 13, 1 to 5, and also the end of chapter 12, brings out this offering that's being made in Bethel, and it's being done by Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam offering on the golden altar in Bethel, there's this prophecy, and this is the prophecy of Josiah. And it took me a little while to figure this out, to sort of understand the connection between this prophecy here and what happens here in the 13th year of Josiah. So let's take a look at that passage. And we're going to start in chapter 12, right at the end. So chapter 12 is all about Rehoboam and the kingdom being divided. And then finally at the end, you're going to have Jeroboam's golden calves, right? So that are set up. And his reasoning is in verse 26. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David. If this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the heart of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he set the one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. And he made an house of high places, and made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not of the sons of Levi. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. And he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel, on the 15th day of the 8th month, even the month which he has devised in his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel. And he offered upon the altar and burned incense. So, I mean, initially I had just read chapter 13. I'd found this prophecy of Josiah. And I wasn't even studying at the time. I wasn't even trying to deal with this prophecy in Ezekiel. I was just studying this prophecy of Josiah. And I found it interesting. So just in that context, and behold, so he's offering at the altar in Bethel, and it says, and behold, there came a man of God out of Judah by the word of the Lord unto Bethel, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. And he cried against the altar in the word of the Lord, and said, O altar, altar, thus saith the Lord, behold, a child shall be born unto the house of David, Josiah by name. And upon thee shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense upon thee, and men's bones shall be burnt upon thee. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, this is the sign which the Lord hath spoken. Behold, the altar shall be rent, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out. And it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which had cried against the altar in Bethel, that he put forth his hand from the altar, saying, lay hold on him. And his hand which he hath put forth against him dried up, so that he could not pull it in again to him. And the altar also was rent, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. So this prophecy, the fact that Josiah is named, I found interesting, but I wanted to find out where it was fulfilled. So first thing is I recognized that there was a symbol here, that there was this 15th day of the 8th month. And I understood that as the symbol of August 15th, which is the 8th month, 15th day, on our calendar. And I also noticed the doublings, altar, altar. So there's these doublings that occur in here. And of course, the significance of the king offering upon the altar, which is something that a king wouldn't do, because this is a mixture of church and state. So there was a lot of symbolism here. And initially I didn't know where this ended. But I had this date. And then what I did is I tried to find out where it was fulfilled. And what I found is it was in 2 Kings chapter 23. So we're going to go there. And in 2 Kings chapter 23, this is in the context, if you read here in, well, it went to First Chronicles, pardon me. I didn't click that right. 2 Chronicles chapter 23. So this is going to be, if you read in the context, am I in the right place? Doesn't look like it's, 2 Kings, pardon me, that's where I did wrong. 2 Kings 23. There, I went to Chronicles by accident. So this is 2 Kings chapter 23, and it was 1 Kings chapter 13. And this is in Josiah's reforms, and this is in the 18th year of Josiah that it's being talked about. So this is when he's going to have his Passover. Now, we're also going to look at 2 Chronicles as well to try to narrow this down. But it's going to talk all about the different things that happened, all these different reforms, and then it's going to talk about the restoration of the Passover. And so in chapter 23, verse 21, you're going to have this here, and it's going to say, but in the 18th year of King Josiah, in verse 23, 2 Kings 23, 23, but in the 18th year of King Josiah, wherein his Passover was holden to the Lord in Jerusalem. So anyway, it's just telling you that this is in the 18th year. Now, it's going to talk about his death, and the other places in 23 verse 15. So it's going to talk about all these reforms that are happening, and they're happening in the 18th year of Josiah. But then in verse 15, it says, moreover, the altar that was in Bethel, and the high place which Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, had made, both that altar and the high place he brake down.
We're going to share the script.
What's that? 2
Okay.
Kings 23 verse 15. He brake down and burned the high place and stamped it small to powder and burned the grove. And as Josiah turned himself, he spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount, and sent and took the bones out of the sepulchres, and burned them upon the altar, and polluted it, according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. Then he said, what title is it that I see? And the men of the city told him, it is the sepulchre of the man of God, which came from Judah, and proclaimed these things that thou hast done against the altar of Bethel. So we have this direct reference to this prophecy. And when I was reading this initially, I took this that this was all in the 18th year, that all these things were happening in the 18th year of Josiah. But I looked at it in 2 Chronicles as well. And in 2 Chronicles, so I got to go back a bit. I got to go up here, Manasseh. It's going to be here. Josiah keeps the Passover. So this is chapter 34. So when Josiah was 8 years old, he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the ways of David his father, and declined neither to the right hand nor to the left. For in the 8th year of his reign, while he was yet young, he began to seek after the God of David his father. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places and the groves and the carved images and the molten images. And they break down the altars of Baalim in his presence, and the images that were on high above them he cut down, and the groves and the carved images and so forth. So it's going to talk about that, all these things that he did. In verse 5 it says, and he burnt the bones of the priests upon their altars and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. And he did in this, and so did he in the cities of Manasseh and Ephraim and Simeon, even unto Naphtali, with their mattocks round about. So, and when he had broken down the altars and the groves and had beaten the graven images into powder and cut down all the idols throughout all the land of Israel, he returned to Jerusalem. So he's going to begin something in the 12th year of his reign, and this is breaking down these altars and burning the bones of the priests upon these altars. So he doesn't just do it in Bethel. He does it everywhere. But he also begins by cleansing the altars in Judah and Jerusalem. So he begins in his 12th year. So I don't know how long it's going to take him to do this, but I would assume that it's going to take him a bit of time. I don't think it's something that's going to happen in a week. Now, as far as in his 12th year, we don't know when he began this work. All we do know is that his reign goes, Josiah's reign is going to go from fall to fall. So it's one of the things we know about Josiah. And we know that for a few reasons. One of them is the Passover, because they find the book of the law and they do all this work, and then they get ready for a Passover in something that's going to take quite a bit of time. And so they're ready for that at the beginning of the religious year, but his 18th year had begun in earlier. So it's in the 18th year that they find this book of the law and do all these reforms. But he had already been doing reforms earlier, so he's cleansing these temples. Now, it doesn't say that it's in the 13th year that he goes to the altar in Bethel. So for me to say that it's in the 13th year is somewhat conjecture. That is, I'm guessing based upon just the logistics of it. But I already had the 13th year where Jeremiah begins his ministry. And based on the fact that he begins in his 12th year, and you would normally do this type of work in the summer and in the fall, maybe even in the spring, that I would just say that his 13th year is when he goes to Bethel. And who knows, maybe it's even on the 15th day of the 8th month that he does that, that he completes that work. I don't know. But the point is, there's going to be a 40 years period of time. And just like this 40 years here, this isn't exactly how we would count 40 years. We would look at 40 complete years. So if you wanted to have 40 years over here, you would have this, 30 AD to 70 AD. And some people do that who believe Jesus was crucified in 30 AD. They put the 40 years there. But other people put 40 years starting with 31 AD. Now, one of the problems that I had personally, as I tried to look at this puzzle, is even though I'm starting here in 977 and I'm finishing here in 587, I looked at the time of year. If I'm starting from Jeroboam's prophecy itself, this is the year of Jeroboam's prophecy, but this is quite late in the year. So this would be in November. Specifically, it's going to be November 22nd. If you're using the biblical calendar. If you use the rabbinic calendar, you would get the date of October 22nd. It would end up being a different date. But that's the actual date, November 22nd. And if you looked at the rabbinic calendar and you put it into the Gregorian year, it would be November 9th, which is an interesting detail here. If you're using, let me think here. I can't remember. I could be wrong about that. but I believe never mind about that. I know the October 22nd one, but I can't remember how the other one works. But anyway, you have these 390 years, but this would be an ordinal count. Even though we're looking at 977 to 587, it would actually really include 390 years, starting with this being the first year, which isn't a problem. So that's not really a problem at all. And even here, when you look at this period of time, Josiah, in the 13th year of Josiah, we don't know exactly when this is, but if this was in the fall of 627, you would actually get here to the beginning of 587. And again, this would be what we would normally count as 39 years. And I want to point those details out, because a lot of times people have asked me about different time periods, and are they exactly, that amount of time? Now, we know we have some time prophecies that work out to the day. The 2300 days is a very specific time prophecy. It's pointing to a day, the 10th day of the 7th month. And it starts on the 10th day of the 7th month in 457 BC, and it ends on the 10th day of the 7th month in 1844. It's exactly to the day on the biblical calendar, 2300 years. But not all time prophecies are like that. They don't have to be exactly to the year or to the day. They have to be to the year in some way. And if I had a criticism, my early criticism of my conclusions was I didn't really have an exact time. Now, of course, I'm counting here from November 22nd, the 15th day of the 8th month. And this is about the prophecy of Josiah. So again, we don't know exactly what the date was, but it very well could have been that he started his cleansing in his 12th year, in the summer, maybe after the spring harvest or whatever, and he went around throughout Judah and Jerusalem, and then he went into northern Israel and began this cleansing, and that maybe in the fall, maybe on the 15th day of the 8th month, he fulfilled that prophecy that was given here. And that would actually be exactly, if it was on the 15th day of the 8th month, it would have been exactly 349 years, I think. Or would that still be 350? It would have been 350. Yeah, so it's 350, but this would be a shorter period. But the point is, it doesn't really matter. This isn't a time prophecy per se. We can just measure this time however we look at it. Yeah, so if this was a fall, that would still be 350 years. Now, but of course, this 390 years just barely makes it. It would be 389. And this is January 5th. So you would say, well, from November 22nd, you'd have December, and then you would have another. So this would be like 7 weeks later of 389 years and 7 weeks if you went from here to here. So somebody could argue, and it's also in the same year, so you would have to do it inclusive or ordinal. You'd have to count this as the first year and this is the 390th year. So those are little details which I know they may not matter to you now, but when you start to explain this to people, you're not gonna make that explanation. You're not gonna go into detail like that. And I generally don't. I mention these details in footnotes in papers to try to figure out exactly these periods of time. But my point is that you need to know them for yourself if you're presenting them to someone. Because if somebody brings up an objection, you need to know why you're making that decision.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
So that's my phone telling me they didn't get it. But anyway, so the other thing is, when we look at this division of the kingdom, Rehoboam is going to take over the kingdom with the death of Solomon. And we don't know exactly when that is, but my guess is it's in the winter of 978 to 977. So somewhere in that winter, you're going to have that change. And then Rehoboam, his first year of reign, to count his first year of reign, would have been in the spring of 977. Now, we know that we're marking this prophecy here on the 15th day of the 8th month that's going to go here. And this is going to give us the year of the starting point and the year of the starting point here as well. But it doesn't mean it gives us the day of the starting point. That is, we don't need to have this prophecy give us exact day in this history that matches up with an exact day in this history. And some people would say, well, why not? Well, because it's not that type of a time prophecy. It is a time prophecy, but it's not that specific. God isn't trying to tell them which day the siege is going to begin, but he is going to give some time in relationship to the destruction of the temple on the 10th day of the 5th month. There is going to be an allusion to that. So we have to address that point as well. Now, as far as other people trying to find solutions to this to me, connecting the prophecy of Josiah here and the prophecy of Josiah here became extremely profound. One is it connected it to our history. Now, the way that happened was when I recognized this 390 years, I also came to understand that there was a year and a half until the destruction of the temple or the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. So there was this year and a half, and I understood then this entire period is going to be 391.5 years, which I had already established that was the years from Rehoboam's reign to the end of the kings of Judah. So from Rehoboam, from the death of his father Solomon, to the death of Zedekiah is 391 and a half years. And I established that long before this, that was the period of time of the kings of Judah. So there was this number, but we also had the prophecy of Josiah. And in 2014, I had studied out, or 2015, I had studied out Revelation 9. And it was in 2016 that I came to understand this period of time. So we had Revelation 9, and we had Josiah Litch, and he had a prophecy of 391 years. And then we have the prophecy of Josiah, and this is going to be from Ezekiel, and that's also going to have 391 years connected to it. And so this connected these two Josiahs. And at the time, in 2016, this is before we had the prediction before midnight, but I'd already started looking at this idea of this prediction, that there's a prediction being made and there's this fulfillment. So I hadn't attached it because we didn't have a prediction before midnight, but I had attached it to the idea of Samuel Snow's prediction and Ezekiel's prediction, and that they were both based upon Josiah. Two different Josiahs. One is Josiah Litch, and in Josiah Litch, he's establishing the year-day principle for the Millerite movement, that it's valid. And Ezekiel, he's also dealing with the year-day principle. And so this idea of the year-day principle, this idea of the two Josiahs, and that there's a prediction that precedes the destruction of Jerusalem, that he's predicting an event, which is the siege, and then you're going to have the destruction of the temple. We'll just go destruction. So you have these two things connected, this first prediction, and this is going to lead to this next prediction. And as I went through this, I started to recognize that there was a bunch of predictions that Ezekiel was making that were occurring. And he makes this prediction, as we know, in 592, so roughly 5 years before the siege begins. And we're going to study into that in more detail, because when the siege begins, when we get to chapter 24, we're going to have the date for the beginning of the siege, but we're going to have a bunch of other prophecies. And so I started to realize that there was all these predictions or all these prophecies. And then what happened after 2016, in 2017, this prediction before midnight came up. And I, in a sense, was already working on the concepts and the ideas that there's this prediction that precedes the message that we're going to give. So we have a prediction before midnight, and that was eventually rejected. Now, I wasn't the one who came up with the term prediction before midnight, but I'd already been working on the concept of it. I just never had a name for it. So it was, I believe, Blessings who came up with that, and it was promoted by Tabo. So we have this prediction before midnight moving through this message in 2017, but it was rejected by Parminder specifically, and it was pushed aside. So it was never really addressed. And one of the problems that I had with a lot of the things that, when things were presented, we had proposals, that they weren't really addressed in the right way. So either they were just dismissed and swept under the rug, they were covered up, new other information, new things just started being talked about, and we would forget about them. So they just kind of be ignored. Or often the messenger would be attacked. But we didn't really go through these things and try to understand them and then address them. So we didn't study them properly in order to know whether or not they were correct. And so anybody who was involved in the movement then remembers this prediction before midnight, but if you try to think about why it just disappeared, there's not really a reason. So there was no reason given. Nobody said even that we're officially rejecting it. It just doesn't come up anymore. And part of it is there's this marginalization of some of the people, but also we know later in hindsight, we know that Tabo and Parminder fought over this issue. We only know that later on. But Tabo acquiesced to Parminder's insistence that it was not relevant because they had this new prophet, which was Tess. And so the new movement ended up just abandoning a bunch of things without any reason. But we also did. That is, nobody really had a reason why we weren't looking for this prediction before midnight. But it seemed obvious to me that when October 13th came about and we predicted November 9th and then July 18th, that this was really about the prediction before midnight. But anyway, that's this 391 years came into play. So that's sort of the background a little bit on how we came about to understand this, that we had this prophecy of Josiah. But I was still, even through all this time, really trying to work out why the prophecy was the way it is, why I didn't have some of the things that I wanted, because I wanted it to be solid, and I didn't understand everything about it. I also had applied a reform line here, which I'm not going to look at right now, but we will look at later on when we get further into this, into the book of Ezekiel. But we know that there's a reform line here because there's a reform period here. And we could even, mark a period of darkness. We could mark the time of the end. And see, I would mark the time of the end here. And then also you have 622, which is the Passover of Josiah. And I would mark that as, because it's a Passover. So I just said I wasn't going to tell you any of this, but I would mark it with 9/11. So I'd have this as the time of the end and this Passover as symbolizing 9/11. And I would go through and develop a reform line. So I'm not going to do that right now, but I just want to show you that we can have that reform line here because a period of reform is going to happen. And so there's lots of different things that we could look at. We can even look at, the progressive destruction of 4 that happens in this history. There's tons of things that we could do to develop a reform line here. And we could look at all these different events, even where we put Ezekiel, here in 592. If you see in our line, if you look at where we're at, and we're saying that Ezekiel typifies this movement, well, this movement comes after 9/11. So then we have to decide what the siege is. We have to decide what the destruction of Jerusalem is. We're going to have this escapee, 6 months after the destruction of Jerusalem. So you're going to have all kinds of things, and you could probably see where we're going with this once we get this reform line developed. Now, I presented this, but it was never, ever addressed, never developed really. I mean, Jeff did initially look at it, and there was a little bit of discussion when I presented it, but it was never really developed. So we know there's a reform line here. Now, we could argue, of course, this reform line is somewhat of a failure in that there's this reform, but it ends in the destruction of Jerusalem. But there's a reason for that as well. So anyway, there's just lots of truth or light that we can gather as we go through this chronology of Ezekiel. So let's go to Ezekiel chapter 4. So I'm taking a lot longer than I want to, but I think these are important details that we have to get in our minds. So I'm just going to read this again, Ezekiel 4, verse 4 to 6, and then go on. So it says, "Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of the days thou shalt lie upon it, thou shalt bear their iniquity." And so we sort of addressed this a little bit, that this is relating to the 40 years where they're bearing iniquity. But, and it says here, "For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on thy right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." So I'm saying that this 40 years, its primary application would be the 40 years from the fulfilling of the prophecy of Josiah until the siege. "And therefore thou shalt set thy face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and thine arm shall be uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it." So the uncovering of the arm is this giving of this message and of what's going to happen in the future. So this is a prophesy against Jerusalem. And then it says in verse 8, "And behold, I will lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to another, till thou hast ended the days of thy siege." So he's acting out this siege. And initially I tried to say, well, maybe this siege is, it's pointing to a 390-day siege. And so I even tried to look at that, literally, could I fit this in, or 390 days and 40 days? And there's no way, no matter how I tried to do it, that I could do that. But he's having this siege. So he has a personal siege where he has this depiction of Jerusalem being under siege, and he's placing an iron pan between him and the city, and he's going to lie on his left side for 390 days, and God is going to lay bands upon him so that he doesn't turn over. So he's going to, face the siege. Now, of course, we know that he's going to lie on his right side for 40 days, and the same thing happens. He's going to face the siege of Jerusalem that he depicted, and he's going to watch it while he's lying on his right side and sleeping. Now, in order to do that, to face the siege, he is actually having to flip over from head to toe the different direction in order to still face the siege and lie on his right side. Because obviously if he just rolled over onto his right side while he's watching the siege on his left side, he would be facing away from the siege. But in both cases, he's going to face the siege. So he's going to set the face towards the siege of Jerusalem. Now it says here that God is going to put him in bands. So, I often find people just saying that, he somehow binds himself. But just is telling me that God is going to cause him not to turn over from one side to another until he ended the days of his siege. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of Ezekiel 4:9 bread, but that comes from Ezekiel 4:9, obviously. And this is a recipe, and I know my brother-in-law, who's a baker, he's baked Ezekiel 4:9 bread on his own, just taking these different grains. Now, the idea of this is that this is the type of thing that you would eat in a siege when you don't have a lot. So you have some wheat and barley, and you got some beans and lentils and millet and fitches, right? You're going to put them in one vessel. You're just going to basically eat a minimum, just something to sustain you, and you're not going to make very much, right? So you're not going to be making a lot. Now, Ezekiel's going to have to prepare this, and obviously he's not going to be preparing 390 days worth of food plus 40 days worth of food, so 430 days worth of food before he goes into this siege. This is something that he's going to have to do on a regular basis. And some people think that when Ezekiel lies on his left side for 390 days and doesn't turn over, that he just lies there for 390 days, day and night. And of course, that's not the case. This is talking about when he's sleeping. He's going to be facing the siege. Now, and they say, well, he could, be awake and still lie there. One is he would get bed sores, lying on his side. He would become very unhealthy. He really couldn't lie there for 390 days. Of course, people will say, well, maybe God did it with some kind of miraculous thing. But we're going to see as we go through this that he didn't actually lie there the entire time. This is just when he was sleeping. So he would sleep facing the siege of the city. And then he had to also prepare this food to eat. And so he'd have to do that on a regular basis. So he'd have to get up and do these types of things. So it says, thou shalt take unto thee all these different types of grains and make thee bread thereof. According to the number of the days thou shalt lie upon thy side, 390 days shalt thou eat thereof. Now, this is something where it's a detail I've noticed recently, and I didn't really think about it before. And so maybe it's something that we could talk about. But it says that he does this for 390 days. It doesn't mention the 40 days. And I just had said, maybe it's 430 days that he has to eat. Now we know he's going to lie on his right side for 40 days as well. So I would assume that it would apply. But the point is here, they only mention the 390 days. And this would be an argument to me that this is referring to that the whole period is 390 days. And the 40 days also points to the end of the same time. So they both point to the siege. So this would just be another argument regarding that there's a separation, that there isn't, you don't add 390 and 40 to get how long, how many years. You don't add those as a period of 430 years. Now we do know the 430 years added together, we notice there's that reference, and other people will notice that reference, but it doesn't mean that we have to have them to be continuous, 390 plus 40. We can have the 40 and the 30 and the 390 years, the last part of that running together. He just can't do it literally in his days that he lies on his sides. And in verse 10, it says, thy meat which thou shalt eat shall be by weight, 20 shekels a day. From time to time shalt thou eat it. So we had talked last time about this language in Ezekiel chapter 4 that we find in Leviticus 26. So this is one of those examples. When you shall eat your bread by weight is what it says in Leviticus 26. And it says, and thy meat which thou shalt eat shall be by weight. So this is something that would be in a siege. You're going to look at your food, you're going to see how much you have, and you're going to weigh it, and you're going to basically, there's a word for it which I can't think of.
Divide.
What's that?
Divide.
Not divide.
Ration?
What's that?
A ration?
Ration it, yeah. So it's going to be a ration. So you get a ration of that. And we know that in Leviticus 26, when it talks about this, it's in the third 7 times. And the third 7 times is fulfilled by just Jehoiachin and his captivity. And in Leviticus 26, verse 25, it says, "And I will bring a sword upon you," so this is the third 7 times, "that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant. And when ye are gathered together in your cities, I will send pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." So this is talking about a siege. "And when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver you your bread again by weight, and ye shall eat and not be satisfied." So again, this bread being delivered by weight. It's measured by weight. And we know that that happened literally with Josiah, or not Josiah, Jehoiachin. So Jehoiachin, in the Babylonian Chronicles, there's a tablet called the grain ration tablet. And the grain ration tablet gives a record of Jehoiachin and his sons and how much bread was measured to them by weight. So they have this bread measured to them. So that symbol applies to Jehoiachin. So we see that language there being used in Ezekiel. So we see these references to the language of Leviticus 26 in Ezekiel chapter 4, 5, and 6. And I did send you a chart with some of these. I'm just going to go here. Where I sent this. This is the notes I sent, and must be a way to make this bigger. Yeah, there we go. So you can see we got this chart here, and that's 4:16. So you can see I got the references on the right side. You can look at your email and see that. So I'm not going to go through it right now, but you can look that over. And some people have sent me some stuff with some of the references that they found. So there's actually more references than this. And here, this chart's just Ezekiel 4 to 6. You can actually include Ezekiel 7, and you'll find references to Leviticus 26. Now, of course, it's understandable that we have this because we know that what's coming actually in Ezekiel is the 4th 7 times. So the fact that Leviticus 26 is being mentioned and referenced is logical. But it doesn't just reference the 4th 7 times, because the 4th is a repeat of all the other 3. It just repeats a lot of the language you see in Leviticus 26, all of the 7 times, even stuff leading up to it. In verse 11, it says, "And thou shalt drink also water by measure, the 6th part of an hin, from time to time shalt thou drink, and thou shalt eat it as barley cakes, and thou shalt bake it with dung that cometh out of a man in their sight." So what this is saying is that now he needs to take this bread that he's going to make, and he's going to bake it over top of dung that comes from a person. Now, this is something that would happen in a siege because you need dung in order to start a fire. So they would burn dry dung. And he's going to do this in front of other people. So he's going to bake his food in front of others with this human dung. And of course, the Lord said, "Even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I'll drive them." So this isn't just referring to the siege itself, but this is referring to the fact that they're going to be scattered. And one of the things that happens when you're in captivity is your food is going to be defiled in some way. So cooking it over human dung is a way of defiling it. But also once they go into captivity, they're not going to have control over the conditions in which their food is prepared. And somebody asked what quantity is a hin. I have no idea. We're going to have to look that up, I guess. But yeah, obviously they have a certain amount of water to drink, and I'm not sure what the 6th part of a hin is. I'm sure it's enough water in order to survive. The Lord said, even thus shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, whither I drive them. And then Ezekiel says, Ah, Lord, behold, my soul hath not been polluted. For from my youth up, even till now, I have not eaten of that which dieth of itself, or is torn in pieces, neither came there abominable flesh into my mouth. So he's just saying, look, I don't want to do this because it's defiled bread. I know I have to do this as an example, but I don't want to. Now, I'm not sure how that applies to us. In the sense, we know Ezekiel is snow, and that there's something that Ezekiel doesn't want to do. But God's going to provide him this compromise. And then he said unto me, Lo, I have given thee cow's dung for man's dung, and thou shalt prepare thy bread therewith. So he's going to cook it over dung, but he's not going to end up defiling this bread by cooking it over human dung. And then said I, Ah, Lord God, behold, my soul hath not, I read that, verse 16. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they shall eat bread by weight and with care, and they shall drink water by measure and with astonishment, that they may want bread and water, and be astonished one with another, and consume away for their iniquity. So I looked ahead at that, but now I want to actually deal with these literal days. So we have this, and to me this becomes a key. A hin is about 1.5 gallons. So a sixth of a hin of water is 1.5 gallons. So I would assume those are probably British gallons. I'm not sure, but you can still put it into cups. And so there's how many cups in a gallon? That would be 48 cups to a gallon, or 24. Anybody know? How many cups are in a gallon? So a gallon, I'll just think of it this way, 4 liters. And
well, 1/6 of 6 quarts would be 1 quart.
yeah, see, we don't usually do it anymore. So a quart is 4 cups. So that you're saying it's a quart, 4 cups of water. Okay. So we're going to deal with these literal days, and the literal days become very insightful. Now, we had worked out that Ezekiel is on the 5th day of the 4th month, and on the 5th day of the 4th month in 592, he's going to give this prophecy that's in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 4 to 6. And so we're going to have him here in 592 on the 5th day of the 4th month. And this is going to be July 21st. And he's going to lie on his left side for 390 days. Now, to know this date, one of the ways that we can do it is I did give you a program, which is basically Parker and Duberstein's dates, but they're a little bit easier than going through a chart. And I'll bring this up here. So this converter just takes all the dates from the 1971 edition of Parker and Duberstein's Babylonian chronology. And I can go to these different years. So I want to go to 592 BC, which I'm at here. And you can see that in the top right. And I need to go to July 21st. And when you do that, you'll see here in the Babylonian calendar, it's the 13th year of Nebuchadnezzar. It's the month Tammuz. It says Uzu. So that's just Tammuz in in Babylonian. It says it's the 4th month in Roman numerals, and it's the 5th day. So we can see that the Babylonian calendar gives us the 5th day of the 4th month. And my argument is that, and whether you use the biblical or the Babylonian, it doesn't really matter in this year. On the Julian calendar, if you go to the 1st day of the 1st month, I just want to show you this here. So we're going to go. And okay, we need to go another month. So here I got Nisan 1, Nisanu, and you'll see that the 1st day of the 1st month is April 19th. And we know in 1844 that the 1st day of the 1st month was April 19th. And that happens once every 30 years on average. So to have the 1st day of the 1st month be April 19th is not that common, right? It's 1 in 30. So it's just interesting that this is what occurs in this year. It's the same, and you're going to find the same when you go to 573 BC, also April 19th, and I can just do this here just easily by going minus 19. Whoops, I'm going to have to go plus 19. So 573 BC, remember we said it was the year in the 10th day of the 7th month, that was October 22nd, and that's because in 573 BC, it's going to be the same date on the 1st day of the 1st month on the Julian calendar, April 19th, as it is in 1844 on the Gregorian calendar. So that coincidence occurs. Now, what we want to do is, we'll do it this way. Go back where I was. So we want to get to July 21st. There we are. And now what we want to do is we want to count 390 days. So there's lots of ways I could do it. I could use the other calendar converter, but I'm just going to do this. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you'll see that when I move 390 days, so I just hit that button 39 times, it brings me to August 15th, 591 BC. So he's going to start here, and you're going to go 390 days, and it's going to bring you to August 15th, 591 BC. And that date on the calendar is not significant specifically, but it's the day before that's significant. So if you looked on this calendar, it would be the 11th day of the 5th month. But the day before is when he completes his 390 days. So this is when the 40 days are going to begin. So we'll just leave this for now. So we're going to have these 40 days begin. And then I can just click on this. And that's going to bring me to September 24th, 591. So this is going to bring September 24th. And that's going to be the 22nd day of the 6th month. So you got the 390 days and then the 40 days. So this is going to start at the symbol for midnight. And this is going to start at the symbol for the midnight cry. And of course, we already saw this symbol when we dealt with the prophecy of Josiah. So this to me is very significant that you have these two symbols, midnight and the midnight cry, for the start of the 390 days and the start of the 40 days. But we can see here that the 390 days, the last day that he lays down on his left side, is going to be on the 10th day of the 5th month. Because the next day he's going to start lying on his right side. So this is on the left side, and this is on the right side. And this symbol becomes really important. Now, Ezekiel is predicting the siege of Jerusalem. But in this 390 days, we end up with this symbol. And this is the date that Jerusalem, or specifically the temple, is destroyed. Now, initially when I looked at this roughly, I thought that these were the same dates, but I hadn't really thought about it in detail. Just counted 390 days, and I counted 40 days. And I came up with this being the 10th day of the 5th month. So if anybody looks at my first video, they'll just see me putting these together. But often I still put them together. I just put August 15th as connected with the 10th day of the 5th month. And I don't work out this detail. I don't deal with this detail here. And that's just because it can confuse people when I'm presenting it to them. But it's something you need to be aware of. You need to be aware of that this deals with the left side, and then this is going to deal with the right side. Now, when we go further, so I'm going to just draw this line under here. So you have here 592 BC, the 5th day of the 4th month, the symbol of midnight. It's also July 21st. So this one has both of these dates that we see in 1844 together. And then you're going to have...
sharing?
Oh, I'm not sharing? Okay, should have done this sooner. Sorry. So here is that left and right side. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this just in, so I got more space here. So you got these 390 days. And normally I just put, the 10th day of the 5th month that ends the 390. And then I'm going to have August 15th that begins the 40, right? So you're going to have these 40 days here and the 390 days here. Now, he's going to have his second vision, and we're going to see that when he has his second vision, it's going to be during these 40 days. And if he's lying on his right side for 40 days, in his second vision, it's going to be saying that he's sitting. So obviously he's not lying down the whole time because he's going to be sitting. But we'll deal with that detail later. So I'm just going to take this out of here. So you're going to have his second vision in here. So you're going to have Ezekiel 8 verse 1. And then you're going to have his third vision. And his third vision is Ezekiel 20 verse 1. It's going to give you a date. And that date it's going to give you is the 10th day of the 5th month. So we're going to look at that in more detail as well when we get to Ezekiel 20, because there's a bunch of details there. But just as far as this date showing up in connection with the end of the 390, and then in his third vision, that same date showing up, and then finally we'll see that Jerusalem is destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month, or the temple specifically, in 586 BC. That these two dates here and this date here, so these two dates are being used, and we can connect them to this date here. So we can see that that he's prefiguring or pointing to the date that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but he does it in an indiscreet fashion. He's not being very clear on that. I don't even know if he knows that that connection exists. Now, he obviously would have known which day it was that he laid down on, the last time he laid down on his left side to complete the 390 days. So he would have known that's the 10th day of the 5th month, which it took us time to figure that out. And he would have known it, because he writes it down, that it's on the 10th day of the 5th month. But he never addresses the date that Jerusalem is destroyed. And I don't know if he even knew that. That is, even though he doesn't hear any news from it until somebody comes and tells him, because he knows that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And 6 months after it's destroyed, somebody comes who sees the destruction of Jerusalem and tells him about it. So we're going to deal with that when we get to that part. later on in Ezekiel with the escapee. But I don't know, maybe Ezekiel never even hears about what date the temple is destroyed. It's possible, or he doesn't hear about it till much later. It's hard to say because the Bible doesn't tell us. So he may not even have understood all of this, but very certainly he did not understand that in 70 AD, the temple would also be destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month. So Ezekiel couldn't have known that. I mean, God could have told him, but that wasn't his message. His message was about the siege of Jerusalem and, of course, the coming destruction connected with that. So just to kind of address this point, which many people have seen before, we know that in 597, this is when Jehoiachin is taken captive. And Jehoiachin's captivity is given as account in Ezekiel. So in Ezekiel 40, for instance, it talks about the 25th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. In Ezekiel 1, it talks about the 5th year of Jehoiachin's captivity. And we also know Jehoiachin was taken captive for 36 years. So Jehoiachin was taken captive in 597, and then he was released in 561, in the 37th year of his captivity. Now, and this is not in Ezekiel, so this isn't Ezekiel's count. In Ezekiel's count, this actually would have been the 36th year of his captivity, but that's the way it's described in 1 Kings and in
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, right? That's in Jeremiah that it references that. And it's very interesting, the study of that, dealing with this. But we know there's 36 years. Now, because this is the beginning of the reign of evil Merodach. But if I go to 70 AD and I continue this count that Ezekiel is using, I will find that from the time that Jehoiachin is taken captive to the time that Jerusalem or the temple is destroyed on the 10th day of the 5th month is a period of 666 years. Right? So we have this period of 666 years. So this count that Ezekiel has set up will give me 666 years as the destruction of Jerusalem. And we all know that Jerusalem was destroyed 36 years after probation closed for the Jews. And since we're having Jehoiachin's 36 years at the beginning, this is typifying something. His captivity here is typifying something here. And it's not as straightforward as that because his captivity is all tied up with this reform line. But we know that we also have Christ's reform line here, and there's events here in 70 AD that are much more complicated than just 70 AD just doesn't pop out of nowhere. I mean, you have the siege that happens in 66 AD as well. So there's a whole bunch of history that we could put into here to sort of connect what's happening in this history with what's happening in this history. That this is typifying, this in a sense is reversed of what's happening here. Because here he's released, here they close their probation. So there's this kind of mirror that exists. But I think this is highly unlikely that this occurred by chance. And when I searched this on the internet, I found only one other person who mentions the 666 years from 597 to 70 AD. But he doesn't connect them with Ezekiel. That is, he doesn't take Ezekiel's count. He doesn't take any of that into account. He just knows that it's 597, that Jehoiachin was taken captive. And he thinks it's interesting that there's 666 years to the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's not something that a lot of other people have noticed. And he didn't take these 36 years and these 36 years and put them like that. So this is something that that I found in 2014, and I thought this just was extremely profound. So this is even before I understood Ezekiel, this is 2000. Well, I understood Ezekiel a little bit. I shouldn't say I didn't understand it in 2014 because I did know about the 390 and the 40, and I did have them end at the siege. But I hadn't put them together with this whole structure of the 10th day of the 5th month. And so I didn't really see how this was Ezekiel predicting 70 AD. But you can see Ezekiel's not directly predicting this, but he is predicting it. He just doesn't know what he's doing. God has ordered these events and these dates so that we could look back at these dates and see something about prophecy. And this is an important point. We know that a prophet is writing for his day because those are the immediate issues that are at hand, and he's writing to the people of his day. And we need to understand how the people understood it, right? But there's also then a fulfillment of that prophecy. And we know the fulfillment of that prophecy becomes typical. It becomes a type. So even though he's just writing for his day, many people just say, well, he was writing for his day, and the only thing we can really learn about it is the spiritual lessons, sort of the devotional aspect of that. And that's the approach that you see in the Sabbath School Quarterly over the last 30, 40 years. Is definitely tended towards a much more devotional repeat of history, if you want to put it that way. There's lessons we can learn. But you can see here clearly that Ezekiel, even though he's predicting an event in his own time, it is reflecting upon this event in 70 AD. And the fact that you saw earlier where you could even take that 390 and that 40 and you could separate it and you could put that 40 years over here from the cross in 31 AD to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And we know we can do that because when we study the midst of the week and we study these things, we can see that the 10th day of the 7th month, which is the destruction of the temple, is connected with the cross of Christ. And I did that in the study of the week of Christ, that we can connect these things. And that we can take Daniel 9, verse 26 and 27, and we can show that when it talks about the midst of the week in the two different verses, that it's also talking about the date of the destruction of Jerusalem. So it's talking about that. So we know those two things are connected. So to put them as 40 years, that's not a problem. But I still think that when we're going to primarily apply that 40 years, from Ezekiel's perspective, it would be the 40 years from the time that the prophecy of Josiah was fulfilled until the beginning of the siege. But we can still take that application of those 40 years and put them here. And that's my point, is that we can look into the future by looking back at the past. And if the people in Christ's day had an understanding of these prophecies, they could have seen when Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. We now can look back and we can see how this all fits. But it would have been much more difficult if you're here in this time period to figure out from Ezekiel that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed in 70 AD, or the temple on the 10th day of the 5th month. That would have been harder to discern, but it wouldn't be impossible. If you were a student of prophecy and understood things, you might have been able to do that. But I don't think they did, because I don't think they had the effect of every vision. In fact, I don't really think they understood prophecy as deeply as we do today, because we have all of these prophecies from the past, and we have a huge understanding about prophecy that they wouldn't have understood. That is, we understand the application in the last days. So when the disciples come to Jesus, what shall be the sign of thy coming and at the end of the world? And, Jesus deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. That's all that would be on the disciples' minds. They wouldn't imagine that they're going to look to 2,000 years later, people studying what Jesus said to them and trying to understand that the end of the world is coming and trying to warn people about it. So they just wouldn't have understood that. So I know I tend to talk a lot and not have that much discussion. Now, is there any questions? Because we're gonna finish this off, this 390 years and this 40 years. We're gonna finish them off tomorrow. because there's still some more things I have to add to them. Is there any questions about things that I didn't explain well, or something that comes later?
You had the reform line and you lined up the Passover with 9/11.
Yeah.
So why did you do that?
Well, 9/11 is the Passover, right? That's where we've always marked it. Now,
Normally the Sunday law would line up with the cross or the Passover.
okay, depends on. So when I say we always have done it, one way in which we did it is we mark it as the first day of the first month, right? 9/11 is the first day of the
Yes.
first month.
Yes.
And we know in Millerite history, there are two Passovers. So when I say always done it, we've always done it since 2017, or at least I have. So we have these two Passovers. We have the true Passover and the false Passover. Because I'm looking at Millerite history, and I'm trying to take, and that's what we're going to look at when we look at this reform line in more detail. So I'm just telling you how I originally looked at it. But we have April 19th, and that's the first day of the first month. Now, we have marked this as the Passover, because I know that I've seen Jeff present this as the Passover. But we also know that in Millerite history, we have April 3rd, which is Samuel Snow's republication of his first letter, and this is the Passover. And then we also have May 2nd, and this is also the Passover. And that April 19th is tying these two Passovers together. That is, this symbol here, this disappointment, separates two different classes. And if you look at Millerite history, the people who accept this as the Passover are the people who are going to accept October 22nd, 1844 as the correct day for the Day of Atonement. But if you're in this history and you don't recognize this as the first day of the first month, so you're disappointed, you say Miller's prophecy has failed, you would then look at this as the correct Passover, because you would have had March 21st as the first day of the first month, because this is what Miller had marked as the first day of the first month. So then this becomes the Passover for those that don't accept, that don't receive the blessing by coming to the 1335. Those that wait until the 1335, that get to here and pass through this history, they're going to receive that blessing, which is the midnight cry. But the people here on this side of this Passover, which is the wrong Passover, they're not going to receive that blessing. So April 19th as the first day of the first month symbolized this separation of the Passover. And we have actually taught that this is the Passover because we taught this was baptism as well. And maybe that's a bit more obscure to kind of connect baptism to the Passover. Because Jesus is baptized in the fall. He's not baptized in the spring. But the Passover is being represented here to some degree by baptism. So this is my main argument. We've looked at this as baptism. We've also looked at it as the Passover. So there's a lot of symbolism that happens with April 19th as the first day of the first month. And that's why I would take that and apply that as the first day of the first month in Ezekiel. So I'm going to take, and the way that I'm doing it in Ezekiel, as I said, I was going to have that time of the end as being, because it's the time of the end of a time prophecy. Well, it's not a time prophecy per se, but the prophecy of Josiah. And then after the time of the end, I have 622. And I'm just telling you the way I did it. I'm not necessarily saying this is correct, but I then marked this as 9/11. And then I could see that 592, that would represent this movement after 9/11. So if you have this as the time of the end, and you have this as 9/11, then you're going to have this movement, which is Ezekiel, and this is going to be snow, right? That's this movement in our history. and there makes sense to it, but there might be more to it. I'm not saying that I'm correct. I'm just telling you how I saw it back in 2017. And then how I saw Samuel Snow's letters connected with that. But it's a very good question. Any other comments or thoughts before we close with prayer? Just another thought about the Passover. The Passover, we know it has a division connected with it. And we know that when Jesus was crucified that day, they're going to have the Passover meal with his disciples. But of course, they're going to prepare for that Passover meal at sunset. And 9/11 represents sunset. And initially, when I was trying to address some of this history, I would place sunset there as well. Once I looked at sunset, and then I took it away. I got rid of it. But we need to somehow, because sunset I still think is a valid perspective for this movement. We have a thing that I think we can apply as sunset. And we haven't really done that because it was rejected and pushed aside without really examining the merits of it. The idea of sunset is definitely clearly marked when you deal with the idea of midnight. So if you have midnight as being July 21st, then obviously the first day of the first month is sunset. And sunset is a symbol of the Passover as well, because it's the division. So there's a lot of things that we could then tie together. I leave these things out all the time when I do presentations. I leave out a lot of these little details, which now we're kind of looking at, but we're not doing it very thoroughly still, right? We could take a whole bunch of time. That question that Stephen asked, we could spend a week studying it and looking at it in more detail as a group. But I think we need to start looking at these things individually and spending some time to examine these questions. I may answer them and people might be satisfied with my answer, but maybe my answer isn't the right answer. Maybe there's something that I'm not missing. So we need to spend some time studying these things. I have a lot of people who are studying these presentations. They're behind because they're studying on the internet. And they keep asking questions because they haven't seen the later studies that I sort of answer. But the nice thing about it is I can see they're anticipating things that I'm not specifically talking about. And some of them are trying to find solutions to things that are later questions that come into mind as we go further in the studies. So my hope is that people study and that you start thinking about things. What I do when I teach guitar, for instance, let's say I teach somebody some concept, or I'm just even when I give them the first lesson and I ask them to practice something. Well, they definitely don't understand what I'm talking about or why I asked them to practice it or I asked them to work something out. But if they have actually tried doing it, then the next lesson, if I have to explain it to them again, they will understand it, even if they didn't understand it the first time. They didn't understand it, they try to work it out, and then once I explain it to them, then it falls into place. So it's extremely important that people are studying things, that you're trying to work this stuff out on your own, because otherwise you're gonna maybe accept my answer, but you're not gonna understand the answer. And also, I have to be corrected. So when Stephen asks questions, he's thought these things through, he's looked at them. And sometimes I find that I'm wrong about something, or there's something that I missed. And so that's why I think it's important that, we ask these questions and we study out on our own to try to figure out what things we don't understand. So that's good for today. So tomorrow, as I said, I'm going to try to finish off this chapter. And I'm going to start looking at chapter 5. And 5, 6, and 7, I might not even get to chapter 5 tomorrow. We'll see. But 5, 6, and 7 don't take as much time. I've looked at them, I've read them over several times. There are some important things in there, but obviously not as much as we see in chapter 4, unless there's just some major things I'm missing. Okay, well, let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful once again that you have been here in our study. We know, Lord, that there's still many things we don't understand, many things that take a lot of thought and a lot of study. But you are making these things clear to us, and we ask that we cannot just understand, but that we can learn how to share. Help us to share the things we learn with others. Help us to participate in discussions online and other ways regarding these truths. Help us not to worry about being wrong, because often we are. We just ask, Lord, that you can help, that you can correct us that when we are wrong, and that our understanding can grow. Be with each person watching these videos, be with those participating, and bring us together again, Lord, we ask, to study your word. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.